Go ahead and turn on your Bibles, and we're going to be jumping all over the place, but we're going to be in Exodus primarily, starting off this morning. And we're going to be looking at how God provides in the wilderness, but more than that, what I really want to be studying is how we react to the providing of God, because God is consistent. God is always faithful. God always provides everything that is needed. And it's a very simple truth for us to understand, is that if we are the children of God, God is going to provide what we need. Now, what we need is not what we want. And that's kind of the rub when it comes to our walk with God. It's not that God hasn't given us what we need, it's that it's not what we want, and therefore we complain. And we have a poor attitude of God. You know, as we're going to be going through this, our memory verse for this next section is in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. The Bible says, "And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." We need to understand who exactly God is. Now, last week we looked at how God is the one who provides, God is the one who leads, God is the one who protects, God is the one who gives us direction. He gives us everything that we need, but how are we going to respond to what God has given to us? Nehemiah chapter 9, the Bible says this in verse number 19, "Yet thou in thy manifold mercies forsookest them not in the wilderness. The pillar of the cloud departed not from them by day, to lead them in the way, neither the pillar of fire by night, to show them light, and the way wherein they should go." Now, we're going to start today by giving God the praise and the glory that He so richly deserves. And this is a summary of God's goodness towards the children of Israel in Nehemiah chapter 9. And we see that God is the one who is directing these people. Now, we need to understand this so that we can properly cultivate an appreciation for God's goodness, so that we can have the thankfulness that He deserves. The blessings that God gives us are innumerable. And something that we're looking at as we go through this is how God provides each and every step of the way, and yet the response is one that is contrary to God. You know, something that I recommend for someone who is going through a period of unthankfulness or a period of depression or something like that, and I've learned this from many different biblical counselors, is to make a praise list where we sit down and day by day we make a list of 10 different things that we are thankful for, that we are honoring God for, that we are praising Him for, and that is something that should be done each and every day if we struggle with an attitude of ingratitude. And this is what this is. It is making a list. You know, if you actually sat down today and tried to figure out how many different ways God has blessed you, you wouldn't have enough time. You know, even going through this, I mean, we're summarizing in just 3 verses so much of what God has done. In this verse, we see that God is leading them in the way. As Christians, we have God leading us in the way as well. He has given us His Word as a light unto our feet, to light our path so that we may have direction in this life in what is a very confusing world that we live in, a very confusing society that we live in. Not only that, but we see that there is the presence of God. As the children of God, if we only had the presence of God and His Holy Spirit indwelling and we had nothing else, we should be thankful. We should be grateful that we should be able to be called the tabernacle of the Most High. And that's what we are. He's given us the earnest of the Spirit. And so in just these 2 things, we have more than enough to be thankful for. Continuing on in verses 20 through 21, "Thou gavest also thy good Spirit to instruct them, and withheldest not thy manna from their mouth, and gavest them water for their thirst. Yea, 40 years didst thou sustain them in the wilderness, so that they lacked nothing. Their clothes waxed not old, and their feet swelled not." You know, and God didn't just stop there with those things. He gave them instruction. He's taught them. He gave them understanding. He gave them principles that they could live by. He fed them on a daily basis. You know, it's been amazing to me in the past. There have been some times where, especially when I was out in the oil field, I remember there was this one time I was unloading some pipe off of a trailer, and as I'm unloading this pipe, I realized that I had forgotten to take anything to eat, and I was hungry. And so I was like, well, okay, well, guess we're fasting today, so let's be spiritual about it, you know, the fact that I forgot my lunch. And so I'm continuing on, and suddenly around lunchtime, my boss gives me a call, and he says, "Hey, Josh, I just want you to know, we ordered way too many burgers for this, staff meeting, and so I left one on your desk. There was one left over, so it's sitting there." I was just amazed. Now, maybe such a small thing, but I wonder how many other small things that God has done for us that we don't recognize as His hand. You know, here are some, if I can put it this way, some small things. The manna was a small thing, as it's described. It is just a little thing that they would go and they would pick up out on the ground. It seemed like something simple. And I think over 40 years, did they think it was anything special? I mean, the first time, obviously they're going to look at it and say, wow, this is amazing, this is fantastic. But over time, later on, they say they loathe that light bread. And so here is a miracle from God where he is providing in a miraculous way something that nobody else gets to enjoy, but they've gotten so used to it, there's no more appreciation for it anymore. It's just what you expect. And so often I think we as Christians, we go through the Christian life, and maybe when we first get saved, we look around and we see the different blessings and we see the little things that God is doing for us, and we just wonder at them. But even as senior saints, as we kind of go along life's road and we're going through the valleys and we're going through the wilderness, we start to lose the wonder. We start to lose the awe. And I think to myself, one day I'm going to stand before God in heaven, and I wonder if there's going to be a replay, and we're going to see just all the different ways that God has blessed us that we have no idea about, that we were completely ignorant of, and yet God has taken care of it. The battles that we never had to fight, the things that we never had to chase after, that it was just there and taken for granted. The reason I say this is because we should have an attitude of gratitude no matter what. Because we don't know necessarily what's even going on behind the scenes. We don't know what the other options are, but unfortunately sometimes we think we do, and we want to chase after those things. We start grumbling. We start complaining. We start whining. Numbers chapter 14, verse number 22, the Bible tells us this. Now, we're going to the end, and then we're going to kind of back our way through. Originally, this lesson was only going to cover the first 2 times that the Israelites complained, but I want to look at it kind of holistically. We're going to look at all 10 times that the children of Israel complained, where they had this grumbling, whining spirit, and see what we can learn from it. The Bible says, because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice. Now, they were whining the entire way from Egypt all the way up to the border of Canaan. And actually, after this, 10 times, they continued to complain a few more times after that. But we see these 10 times, and if we go back and we study the Bible, we see that these 10 times happen in the space of just 2 years. In just 2 years, they were whining and they were complaining, and God said he'd had enough of it. He had enough. He was frustrated with it. He said, this is enough. This attitude of unthankfulness, of whining, of complaining, of constantly moaning and griping and grumbling, it shows an attitude of covetousness, ingratitude, fearfulness, faithlessness, pride, lusting, idolatry, and impatience. It's all bad. Every last time we look at, different angles of what it is to complain, it's always in a negative light. And that's what really complaining is. It's seeing everything in a negative light. And so there is no good way to look at complaining. There is no good justification for complaining. Now, there's a difference between complaining and crying out. God wants us to cry out to him. He wants us to call out to him. He wants us to bring those burdens and those needs to him. But the children of Israel were not crying out to God. They were complaining about God. They were frustrated with what God had given, with what God was doing, with where God was directing. We go back to the very first example in Exodus chapter 14, verses 11 through 12. And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt? Now this is actually backing up. We've already looked at this passage before, but this is the first time the children of Israel complained. And when they're complaining, they're overwhelmed by the oncoming attack. The Egyptians are chasing after them. They think they're going to die because they see those chariots that are going after, and there's no way of escape, and so they think, we're going to die. This is awful. Is this what you intended for us? And so the first thing that they start to complain about is the intentions of God. Did you bring us out of here in order to die? All their fears, all their insecurities was the only thing that they could see. They didn't see the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke that was guiding them. Instead, they saw that pillar of dust that was behind them. And their focus was they were right all along. You ever notice that when you get a grumbling attitude, all the things that you thought were going to happen, when one of those happens, we start complaining like, I knew it was going to happen this entire time. And we start sharing that frustration. I knew I was right. And so I'm justified in my complaining because, I was right. We said this was what's going to happen, and that's what we see happening here. And oftentimes we have a complaining spirit, we have a grumbling spirit when we start talking about things that have not happened yet, but we decide beforehand that it's going to be bad. It's going to be awful. Sometimes someone will say something like, oh, it's going to be an awful day. Well, if you make that kind of decision, yeah, it sure will be. Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes, the grumbling and the complaining is for things that have not even happened yet. It is a foretelling, a prophecy. It's terrible. It shows, again, a complete lack of faith in God, that God is bringing these things into our life and we say, nope, I knew God was going to do this. Whoa, that's dangerous. That shows a complete lack of faith in God. Now, God is very patient, God is very tender, God is very kind. And so we see God's response here, okay? He comforts the people, he tells them it's going to be okay, he provides a way through the Red Sea, and he tells them to move forward. And so sometimes when we have a complaining attitude, maybe the best thing we need to do is, stop complaining and just move forward and stop trying to guess at all the different evil that's going to happen and just go and see what God can do instead. We look on to the second example that they complained. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Now this complaint took place just 3 days after they had crossed the Red Sea. So I want you to get in kind of the same headspace. Hey, they had crossed the Red Sea, mighty, incredible miracles. If you look at Exodus chapter 15, the first 22 verses are singing the song of Moses, where they're extolling the greatness of God and the virtues of God and how God is delivering them and God is giving them the victory, and they're dancing with their timbrels and they're singing and everything is wonderful. And then one verse later, the flip instantly gets switched. They come to this water after 3 days' journey and they start complaining because they were bitter. Now, they needed water. Okay, people need water, and so 3 days, if they hadn't had any kind of refill on water, no doubt their canteens were getting emptied out. No doubt this was a legitimate concern. There was a lot of people, anywhere from 2 to 6 million people were wandering in the wilderness, and so a source of water was going to be a major deal. But how did they respond to this need? Again, look at how they go. They came to Marah, and they called it bitter. And they became bitter. All their hopes, all their affections, all their desire was certainly set on this water. Imagine, if you will, going through this dry and thirsty land. You're going through this wilderness, and you see that reflection of water. And you realize it's not a mirage. It's really just right there. How much expectation, how much hope, how much of your peace and your joy would be set upon going to that water and getting a drink? And then they came to it. They go to try and satisfy that need, and it's not what they expect. And because it didn't meet the expectations, they instantly go from loving it to loathing it. But they direct the complaint, again, at God. What are you doing, God? Why is this, God? What's taking place here, God? And instead of going to God for the answer, they just go to God with problems. Nothing but complaining once again. Now, God's response was to take a nearby tree, cast it into the waters, which were then miraculously made sweet. And God can take our dashed hopes, those things that we look forward to, the things that we think, this will give us our peace, this will give us our satisfaction, but then they don't. God can still turn that around for good. And oftentimes I find in the will of God we have these expectations, and then our expectations are broken. And then God revives those expectations, and he brings us higher than we would have ever been before when we see how he has miraculously worked. God's plan was God's plan was always for them to be able to drink from those waters. But they got to see, the power and the goodness of God in it. And instead of having bitter waters or even plain waters, they got to have sweet waters. And sometimes God will allow our expectations to be dashed to test us, to prove us, to see if we will trust him even when our expectations are broken, or if we're going to complain, if we're going to be frustrated. But either way, God provides for his people. He did not leave them to die there of thirst. Fast forwarding to the third temptation. And the children of Israel said unto them, would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full, for ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, this one took 1 month after leaving Egypt. If you start going through the timeline, it's about a month later, and you can see that they are hungry. Which again makes sense. They came out with flocks, they came out with herds. No doubt they came up with, some bread that they had in their kneading troughs as they're going out, and they came with what supplies they had. But after a month, maybe those supplies are running out. And so they're starting to get hungry. And what they start doing is, as that hunger creeps in, they start getting this nostalgia, that washes over them. It used to be better back in Egypt. They start looking at the past with those rose-colored glasses, and they didn't see all the negativity. They only saw what was positive. They forgot about the whips, they forgot about the bricks, and they only remembered the flesh pots. Remember when we had that big pot and there was meat in there and we could just reach in and grab as much as we wanted, and oh man, that was fantastic. But it's incredible that they didn't even realize that those flesh pots were sitting empty in Egypt. Those 10 plagues wiped those out. Those were gone. Hey, there was no flesh there to be had, even if they did go back. But it's funny, when nostalgia comes in, it's like we forget there's a reason that it passed away and it's gone. and now we have to move forward. But oftentimes we get a complaining spirit because, things used to be better. Things used to be so much better, and now there's these changes, and with these changes, everything is awful, everything is worse off. And so we get this complaining spirit. Now God, once again, answers their need. These murmurings, once again, were directed at God. He said, would to God you'd killed us, in the land of Egypt. I wish God had killed us back there instead of out here with hunger, which is an attack against God. It's doubting the intentions of God once again. God's response was to take these murmurings and answer them. He gave them quail in the evening and manna, the bread from heaven. For every person, the providence would be enough. And I find it really interesting as they're going through and they're gathering this manna. Once again, it would be laying around the camp, kind of like morning dew. And they would go and they would take the manna and they would fill up a homer, for each person, or an omer. And as they're filling this thing up, he that gathered little, he lacked nothing. So I don't know if that means he put a couple in there and then all of a sudden it would expand and fill up that pot. I have no idea. I'd love to see it someday. And then there are others that are trying to jam as much as they can in there, and they'd gather as much as they could, and it would still be an omer. Which tells me that God is going to provide what God is going to provide, and that's always going to be enough because he knows exactly what we need, and oftentimes we have no idea what we need. Those that would gather little, they don't know what they need, so God gave them a little more. Those that gathered too much, once again, they had no idea what they needed, and so God, he shrunk it down. They were supposed to live day by day, no longer. And we see that once again with this manna, with the fourth complaint. They were told to take in their daily bread. Moses said, let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. So here's your daily bread. Take this today. And they did not. Now the reasons that they did not are never made clear to us. It really doesn't matter. They disobeyed the commandment of God. It could be that they were thinking, well, maybe there's not going to be manna tomorrow. Maybe God is going to stop providing, and so we're going to eat half today and we'll leave the rest for tomorrow, because just in case, God might fail us tomorrow, and so let's go ahead and stockpile this stuff while we can. We're going to ration it out. And it bred worms and it stank. Or it could be that somebody just did not care, and they just left of it because they, I don't really like it, so whatever, I'm just going to leave it for tomorrow. Maybe I'll be hungrier then and I'll take care of it. In either case, they disobeyed God. They disregarded his commandments, and so it bred worms and it stank. They didn't appreciate the portion that God gave, and so it rotted right there in front of them. God's response to this, we see Moses getting upset with them. Now, Moses was a meek man, but we're going to see kind of this pattern of frustration build, and it's going to culminate later on in his ministry, but here we see Moses is angry. Here's the complaint, here is the answer to that complaint, and yet they disobey. So we have the complaining, and the answer is given, and yet they deny the answer. And sometimes, have you ever noticed when you're complaining, you don't actually want a solution? The solution is secondary to the complaint. We want to complain, and we want someone to hear our complaint, but if someone offers us, a way to make the complaint better, excuse me, I got to save this till tomorrow. I can't have this complaint satisfied today. I need to go ahead and lay up some more complaint for tomorrow so I can stay in this complaint. And it breeds worms and it stinks. Becomes awful. And those complaints build up. They're destroying. They're disgusting. And yet, that's what a complaining attitude does. It's a beautiful picture. We continue on in verse number 27, the fifth complaint. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Now, God had told them, on the sixth day, on Friday, you're going to gather twice as much. Now, once again, twice as much of little, or it's not that much more work, is what I'm trying to say. It didn't take a lot to fill up these pots. And so they're supposed to gather twice as much, so on the Sabbath they could have a day of rest, which is a great deal. Let's just look at this. You'd have to do nothing, the seventh day of the week. And sometimes I think, I'm really looking forward to the millennial kingdom when we get to enjoy that Sabbath, and we just don't have to do anything at all. It sounds wonderful. And that's what the children of Israel were commanded to do. You're going to get twice as much. God is going to provide everything. And then you're just going to be able to sit back and enjoy this rest. That's all. God would provide. And yet, they came out the seventh day anyway. Even though God had provided everything that they needed, they still wanted more. They still weren't content with what God had given. They weren't content in that rest. And really, that's what it means when God provides. You get to enter into rest because God's going to take care of it. So I don't need to worry because God promised to provide. I don't need to worry because God promised to direct. I have no need of anxiety. I have no need of fear. But instead, I look at God's providence, and even though it is enough, Well, I want more. I want to find this extra margin. This is supposed to be God's, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and skim off of that. And what I find is oftentimes with the complaining spirit, people look to take from God what belongs to God and use it to chase after their own lust. That's why you see, people skipping out on devotions. Why do it? Because they're not satisfied with God portions. They need something else, whether that be sleep, or they need to stay up late, watching movies or whatever it may be, or they need to get to work a little bit extra early or make that extra money. But suddenly, whatever God has provided is not enough. They need more of that and less of Him. And it's a shame. It's a complaint that God, once again, He didn't put any extra manna out for them on Sabbath. So how did God respond? He saw their need. They needed more in their imagination, but God didn't give it to them. My grace is sufficient. And there are some things that God hears our complaint. He knows exactly what it is that we want. He understands completely. He just says no. And so these people are wandering around, and no doubt they were frustrated. They were complaining, where's the manna? And God said there'd be no manna there. There'd be no satisfaction there. And it frustrated them. We move on to the sixth complaint. Wherefore, the people did chide with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses. Now, this is Exodus chapter 19, verse number 1. We actually look at, we're not going to look at, but if you study it, you'll actually see that tells us that they arrived in Sinai on the first day of the third month, which means that they're complaining about this water missing within a 2-month period twice. 2 times, and we're probably talking about a matter of weeks between these 2 complaints, and it's the same complaint getting circled over and over again. They didn't learn the first time when God provided them with water. They just keep going back. You ever notice that sometimes with a complaining spirit, we just go back and complain over the same things over and over and over again, and it's almost this vain repetition of complaining, and the more they repeated it, I believe the worse that it got. We actually see that the people here, they were ready to stone Moses. Hey, they were so upset that they didn't get their water. They were so enthralled by their complaining and in their reasoning. And again, in that complaining mindset, they thought that they had, ammunition for this battle against Moses. This is the second time it's happened. Hey, did you not hear us the first time? Did you not understand our needs the first time? And so they're using the first time not as God provided the first time. Why wouldn't He provide the second time? Instead, they're looking at God left us thirsty once, and He's doing it again. How could this keep happening to us? And it's miracle after miracle that are being provided for. I mean, the manna's come, the quail has come, the water's parted. God has done many mighty miracles up until this point, so that, I'm just being honest, every last experience the children of Israel ever had with Jehovah at that point, think about the children of Israel, every experience they had was miraculous. There was not a single time where they had any kind of relationship with God where there was not some kind of great sign given. We see miracle after miracle in the 10 plagues. Before the 10 plagues came up, as they're crossing the Red Sea, as they're going through the wilderness, everything is being miraculously provided for, and yet all they see is only problems. Just more to complain about, more reason to complain. All these different things are happening to us, and they're forgetting the second half where all the good came into their life. Now, we see God's response here. I want to mention this as well. Here's their attitude. They named that place Meribah, and the Bible tells us in Exodus chapter 17 that they called it that place because they said, "Is the Lord among us?" And that's kind of a challenge, isn't it? Where here they are, they're standing where God has brought them, where God has been leading, where God is directing. They can literally see the cloud and the pillar. There is God dwelling among them, and yet they called that place, "Is the Lord among us?" And in their complaining attitude, even though God had delivered miraculously all throughout their life, even though God had answered every problem to bring them that far, they're wondering, is God even here? And oftentimes, once again, that complaining spirit brings us to the exact same place where we're wondering, is God even here? Even though, more than likely, it's dealing with an issue that God has already answered for us before in the past. Something that God has previously satisfied, and yet, even though God has shown Himself to be good in our lives time and time again, yet we can still get to a place where we're complaining and wondering, is God even here? Does God even care? Does God even do anything for me? And it's a dangerous place to be. We see the response of God. That's when Moses took and he smote the rock and it gushed forth the water and the people drank. Now God provided in His timing, in His way, and something that we need to understand is patience. Sometimes God likes to use unorthodox methods. That's how He gets the glory. And so God always provides, and He'll provide even if there seems like there is nothing to provide with. We move on to the seventh complaint in Exodus chapter 32, verse number 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. Okay, now once again, this is a period, Moses was up there for about 40 days. Okay, they got there on the first day of the third month. Okay, about 6 days later go by, he goes back up, and so we're probably about 4 months in. Okay, in the previous complaint, they were ready to stone Moses. They wanted him dead. Okay, but now they're like, hey, Moses has disappeared. What are we going to do without him? And all of a sudden their dependency was completely on Moses, which it didn't matter what was happening. They were going to complain. If Moses was there, we'll complain. If Moses is gone, we'll complain. And so it became a standard operating procedure no matter what the actual circumstances were. And so they said, well, if it's only bad no matter what, we'll make us a new god. And what I find just absolutely disheartening is that they make this idol. And here they have this golden calf. And Moses and Joshua later are coming down and they hear this noise coming from the camp. And this noise is so great that Joshua thought it's the noise of battle. They are screaming, they are shouting, they are absolutely doing, incredible things, in order to worship this calf that had done nothing. This is about as celebratory as we ever see the children of Israel, and the calf had only ever taken from them, took their gold, took their jewels, It had done nothing. It had accomplished nothing, and yet they celebrated more in that thing that they had made more than in what God had provided them. Who gave them that gold? It was God. And yet they took the providence of God, they took the goodness of God, they took the jewels and the riches and the glory and the grace of God, and they fashioned it into something that they could fall after, they could lust after, and they could worship that more. And oftentimes in complaining, that's exactly what we do as well. We take the goodness of God and the providence of God, and we go and we try and make it into our own lust that we're going to chase after, denying who gave it to us, complaining about who gave it to us, rejecting who gave it to us, and instead worshiping that. We ought to be thankful for our job that God gave us. But we ought to be thankful for God more than we are for the job that provides. We need to be very careful of a critical and complaining spirit because God takes it personally. We see God's response. He was ready to destroy the people. He said, that's enough. Hey, now, Moses and him had a talk, and God said, look, for my great name's sake, I'm not going to destroy them. And so God provided. But it wasn't for their sake, it was for his name's sake. We need to understand something. The reason that God blesses us, the reason that God gives to us, the reason that God protects us and guides us and directs us is because of his promises and his goodness and his mercy and his grace. But we need to be careful testing the patience of God. God is very patient. God is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but patience has its end. And we can tempt the Lord our God. We see the eighth complaint, the eighth temptation. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. Now, Numbers chapter 11, we're jumping ahead a couple books, okay? And so it's kind of hard to follow in the timeline, where does this take place? But it actually picks up with the children of Israel leaving Mount Sinai, and it's about a year later. Okay, so about a year has gone by since the last complaint. They've been at Mount Sinai this entire time. They've gotten the 10 Commandments. They've gotten the tabernacle together. They've gotten the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifices and the offerings, and that's what you see in the earlier books. And now they're getting, ready for battle. The ordinance has been given. This is how you're going to march. Let's go. And the very first thing they do, 3 days after leaving Mount Sinai, is complain. Everything's been set up, everything's been organized, everything's been good. God has provided for them miraculously out Mount Sinai this entire time. It's time to move forward, and yet they complain. What I find interesting here is that God does not even mention their complaint. We have no idea what they were complaining about. It was just noise. It was just this murmuring, grumbling spirit. God's response, he started fires at the uttermost ends of the camp. He said, bring it in a little bit closer, guys. These that are grumbling and complaining and looking elsewhere and chasing after these things, that's going to get set on fire so that you draw closer to him. If you actually look at before the previous chapters, God put them in order. He put them in a race so that they draw nigh, and everyone was to be gathered around the tabernacle. And it was the tabernacle that was following after God, and they were supposed to stay close. Those on the fringes were the ones that were complaining, that didn't want to follow after God. They were looking after their own way, and so they were complaining. They didn't like the direction God was going, is my guess. Now, we don't ever see it said, but it's around the fringes. These people were scattering away from God. We see the 9th complaint. We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. Now, the fires, have just been put out. Let me go back. Verse number 1, they were displeased, for something. God put them some fires in the camp. Verse number 5, it's the very next thing that takes place. They are once again falling after their lusting. God had been providing for them miraculously this entire time, but it was a complete dissatisfaction once again, to the point where they are weeping. They said their soul is dried up. If I can put it this way, oftentimes a complaining spirit causes us to dramatize our issues. We kind of really, put them out there like it's a really big deal. That complaining spirit, one of my daughters, and I love her with all my heart, but sometimes, little tiny kids, they have a hard time, and it is a little bit funny, but she'll just say, I can't. I just can't. And it doesn't matter what the thing is, I just can't. Now, I know where she got that from. It's me. She inherited it from me. And there are some times where I can get overly dramatic and just think, I can't do it, I can't, I'm walking away. And it causes other people to look at me like I'm crazy. And there's a good reason for it. It's because I'm acting crazy. It's a good assumption to make in those moments. But we can be overly dramatic in our complaints if we just sat down and examined them sometime. Those complaints that we have, those things that we're whining about, we'll understand how foolish they are. Oftentimes we don't tell other people our complaints because we don't want them to tell them that it's silly. We don't want them to tell us that it's silly. And so oftentimes what you'll have is these complainers, they kind of gather together because they won't have them, telling each other that they'll kind of build the scenario, build the case in their head. And you'll find that complainers have this ability to cluster. And so we need to be very careful about who we keep company with. And we'll be looking at that again in a minute. But we see that, the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Now, again, God is loving, God is kind, and God is going to provide. God is not sarcastic. I just want to say that. But sometimes the way that he answers, it makes me wonder. And here's what I mean by that. God sent them quail. He said, okay, you want flesh, I'll give you flesh. So he sent them quail that were 2 cubits high in depth. And so they woke up in the morning, and a 3-foot pile of quails was round about the camp. And it wasn't just round about the camp, about 2 to 6 million people, but it was a day's journey of quail, which means it was anywhere from 20 to 25 miles long of a ring of 3 foot of quail going around. I was kind of interested, so I went and looked at the Mount Sinai Peninsula to try and figure out how big it is, and it's looking at about like 20% of the landmass of the Sinai Peninsula at that point was covered in quail, so that when they got up, they would look around and they would see quail everywhere. Now, God was able to bring those quail at any time. Anytime, he could have done it. And sometimes I think, with complaining, God's blessings are everywhere. They are far abundant. They are far beyond what we'll ever be able to get a hold of, far beyond what we'll ever be able to eat, far beyond what we'll ever be able to, even journey through in this life. And yet, we can fall to lusting. We can fall to this complaining attitude. We go to the 10th complaint. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, and wherefore hath the Lord brought us unto this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? This was at the border of Canaan. The 12 spies go in, they all come back. 10 give the good report, 10 give the evil report, 2 give the good report. And so, of course, this people, they believe the 10. And they go with the complaining, and they start saying, oh, that's it, this is the end. After all that God has brought us through, after all the deliverance, and we say, well, they hadn't faced any battles yet. No, they had faced battles. They'd already gotten the victory in those battles. God had already shown multiple times that he was going to provide for all of it, and yet they come up to the land in a journey that should have taken 11 days. God gently led them along for 2 years. He was being patient. He was being kind. He was taking them along slowly. He was getting them ready for those battles that were coming. And yet, they refused to go in. They were complaining about having, no leeks, no fish, no melons, no all this other kind of stuff. But if they'd have gone into the land of Canaan, they would have had milk and honey and everything else. But they just would not cross over in the border. They said, no, it's better for us to stay in the wilderness. 9 complaints saying, what are we doing in this wilderness? And then God brings them to a better place than they have ever been before. God brings them to the very edge of victory, and he says, right here, take a step, go over. And they said, no, we like it better in our complaining land. They wanted to stay. So what was God's response? He said this, "As ye have spoken in my ears, so will I do to you." Okay. God said, that's enough. If that's what you want, that's what you can have. You're not allowed to go back into Egypt. You can't go back there, but you're also not going to go into the promised land. If you're going to stay in this complaining spirit with this complaining attitude, God says, okay. And sometimes I want you to understand, and I need to understand in my own life, that if I want to have a bad attitude and complain about everything and just everything be miserable and, not be happy with anything and be completely unsatisfied and only see problems everywhere, God isn't going to say, "Oh, you poor thing. Let me just do miracle after miracle after miracle, so that I bless you abundantly above all others so that you have no complaints." No, He's going to say, fine. If you want to whine, whine. If you want to complain, complain. If you want to spin in circles out in the middle of a dry and thirsty land, never getting anywhere, go right ahead, stay and wallow in that bitterness and in that frustration and in that complaining attitude. You can stay there. And they stayed there until that generation died. They stayed there for an additional 38 years. Psalms chapter 106, verses 24 through 25 tells us this, "Yea, they despise the pleasant land. They believe not his word, but murmured in their tents and hearken not unto the voice of the Lord." We need to be very wary of our complaining attitude. We need to be very, very careful, especially as the children of God, as the saints of God. I'm assuming if you're here this morning that you are saved, you are a child of God. God is going to take care of everything for you. We need to be careful that we're not despising what God is doing for us in our lives. And it can sneak in. I think sometimes we don't recognize how bad it actually has gotten and the effects that it has on us. Just physiologically, I've mentioned this before, but it was years ago. So there are some studies that suggest that the average person complains anywhere from 15 to 30 times a day. Okay, now that's not what's taking place in the heart. That's just what's coming out of the mouth, like recordable instances of someone talking to someone else, airing a complaint. On average, they said closer to 30 times a day. Okay? Not only that, but that's filtered by a whiny heart. That's not everything that's taking place on the inside. Stanford University studies found that complaining actually physically reduces the size of your hippocampus. It shrinks your brain to complain. And not just to complain, but hearing complaining for 30 minutes a day can have permanent brain damage on you. Okay? That's what these studies find. If I can put it this way, God did not create us to complain. That's not what we're meant to do. It's contrary to very creation itself. And we see, with that hippocampus being damaged, what happens is it actually reduces your memory and problem-solving ability, which as we're going through these 10, different areas that Israel was struggling with, they kept forgetting everything that was good, and they couldn't figure out anything on their own except for complaining. And so I think there were some hippocampuses that were shrinking in the land of, in the wilderness of sin. As the synapses kind of fire together, okay, it's said that they wire together. So the more you complain, okay, your brain starts learning like this is the way you think. And so it starts wiring and making those things stronger. So you'll start naturally thinking, okay, of a complaining thing. So for example, okay, if anyone was ever bit by a dog when they were young, okay, then when I say dog, you're going to have fear instantly there, because that's what you kept thinking about over and over. It doesn't matter what the other dogs do. Meanwhile, someone who had positive experiences, maybe a wonderful, relationship with the puppy, when they hear the word dog, they're going to be flooded with these good feelings. Okay, same exact word, same exact situation, but their attitude completely changes their emotional response and their actions, their behaviors that are going to follow. Complaining also releases cortisol, the fight or flight mechanism, which raises heart disease, cholesterol, diabetes, obesity, and increases your risk of stroke. Optimistic people, they have found, have a 55% lower risk of death across all causes. Just across the board. Simply being optimistic, having hope, okay, raises 55%, lowers 55% your risk of death across all causes. And also, you're 23% less likely of heart disease. Also, that heightened stress leads to headaches, insomnia, bowel issues, okay? Complaining physically does not work. That doesn't even get to, if I'm going to look at the three parts of a person, we have the body, the soul, and the spirit. It shuts down your body. Not only that, but I believe it also shuts down your very soul. Okay? It shuts down the relationships that we're made to have. Constantly having a complaining spirit, it pushes people away from you. It gets them to go away. So it damages not only your health, it damages your relationships, but beyond all that, it damages your relationship with God himself. But with many of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. These are our examples. When God gave us this example of the children of Israel going through and having these 10 different times where they were complaining, God was trying to teach us something. Because we too can have a complaining attitude. We can have a complaining spirit, and it is contrary to our relationship with God. It denies who He is as a person. It denies His providence. It denies His grace. It denies His mercy. And if we are regarding iniquity in our heart, God will not hear us. You know, God will provide for us either way, but as you go through these examples, you see complaint after complaint. Things got harder and harder for the Israelites the more they complained. It never solved anything. I can't go back on my life, and I've had many, many instances of complaining. I'm right around that 30 a day kind of guy. And I can't go back and say, you know, things were so much worse before I started whining about it incessantly. That really improved my situation. Everything is so much better now that I've complained it, now that I've shared it. And we need to understand, there is a difference between sharing our burdens, and complaining. You know, we're not supposed to just bottle up all of our emotions and all the negative things that happen to us and just pretend that they don't happen and, kind of skip along life's way, completely ignorant. That's not what we're talking about. But there's a difference between bringing our grievances to God, and having a faith in God that, look, this is what I'm going through, but I know God is going to carry me through. Yes, I'm in hardship right now. Yes, I'm in pain right now. But I know whom I believed in, and I'm persuaded that He is able. He is going to. Would you pray for me as I'm going through this? We need to give God the glory in our time of tribulation, not give God our doubt. We need to place faith in Him, not fear from Him. That's the difference between complaining and a grateful spirit.